Thanks for joining me today. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video, I'm going to improvise a landscape painting using just a few brushes in Corel Painter Essentials 6. I'll be starting with a new canvas that is 2560 by 1440 pixels. I chose this size because it fits nicely on my screen, but you could choose any size canvas you like. I'm going to select the paint bucket tool in the toolbar, and then over in the color picker, I'm going to pick a nice sky blue color. I want it to be a little bit gray. I'll try this color first. I'll click on my canvas. If I don't like the color, I'll change it and try something else. I think something a little more gray works better for me. I'll create a new layer down at the bottom of the layers palette. I'll double click on that layer to name it. I'll call it mountain. And this will be a layer for the mountains. I'm going to be separating a lot of layers here. Next, I'll choose a brush from the brush selector. I'm going to select Acrylics and Oils Wet Oily Brush. And the color that I want is going to be just a little bit darker, maybe a little bit less saturated and shifted a tiny bit toward indigo, so that I have a blue that's just slightly different, but we don't want there to be too much contrast between the mountain and the sky. That'll help it look farther away. Now this brush is a little bit tricky because it can blend and add paint. When you pick the brush up, it's almost like you're dipping the brush in more paint, and when you put it down, if you keep it down and you keep rubbing it on the canvas, you'll notice that eventually it doesn't deposit paint, it just blends it. And so I'm using it much like I would with traditional paint to blend out that edge. I'm going to repeat that process, and I'm going to choose a slightly darker blue. I'll create a new layer for Mountain 2, and I'll put that mountain overlapping the one behind it. And I'll create a third mountain layer. I want my color to be darker, and what can be helpful is to move the color picker over and just compare the color on the color picker swatch versus the color underneath. That'll help you make better judgments. I'll just put in a little mountain peak here in the foreground. Now the brush I was using isn't very big, but if you make an even smaller brush, that'll help you get more angular mountain peaks. I'm going to create another new layer, and I'm going to name this one Land Far. This will be land that is far away. It's going to overlap the edge of the mountains. I'm going to select kind of a blue-green color like this that's a little bit desaturated. I'll go ahead and just blend that up into the mountains. I'll leave a little bit of that light area that we reserved at the bottom edge of the mountains. I'll make my color a bit darker, and I'll go ahead and blend that in a bit. And I'll make my color even darker, shift the hue a bit more toward green, and I'll put in some of that and just fill in all the way down toward the bottom using a big brush, and just make sure to fade that edge up. I'll create another new layer. I'll call that Tree Left. I'm going to select a more green hue, and I'll just use kind of a dark green to put in a tree over on the left. I'll create a new layer for tree on the right, and I'll do the same over on the right. These will be big trees that are close to us in the foreground. I want to put some trees in the midground, so I'll create a new layer above Land Far. I'll call it Trees Far 1, and I'll put in kind of a medium green color. Again, you want this to look kind of distant, so if you use lighter colors, it'll help with that. I want to blend the bottom edge of those trees. I'm going to select a blender called Wet Oily Blender. Now this is going to add paint and blend at the same time. You may want to adjust the opacity. I lowered it to 41. So I'm able to blend and then kind of also add in a bit of that green color that I had selected. It's kind of like blending with a dirty blender. I'm going back and forth between the wet oily brush and the wet oily blender and just putting in some trees and then blending their edges to add detail and kind of set them back into the distance. I'll create another new layer called Trees Far 2. Just like I did with the mountains, I'm going to select a darker color and I'm going to overlap the trees behind it with some trees that are in the foreground. I'll use the same technique and the same brushes I used for the previous line of trees. And I'll repeat that once again with a darker green color. And all of those layers will help my painting look like it has three-dimensional depth, like it goes off into the distance. I'll just kind of fade out the bottom here. Now if you're happy with your progress so far, feel free to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go to File, Save As. I'm going to save my progress as I go along. Now we're ready to start adding some detail to some of these layers that we blocked in. I'm going to go to the canvas layer, which is the sky, and I'm going to select a lighter, brighter blue. And I'll just use a bigger brush just to kind of randomly dab some stuff in here. I'll sample that base color and make it a bit darker and more muted, and I'll darken the sky up at the top, and maybe a bit darker up in the top left corner. Now I'll go back to an even brighter, almost white, light blue color, and I can put in some little hints of clouds surrounding the mountain, maybe some brightness down near the horizon. I'm really just kind of spontaneously putting this in and letting it blend together. You could use a smaller wet oily blender to blend some of those edges as well. Now, since we have a lot of these objects on their own layers, we can take advantage of that, and we can do a trick that's called Select Layer Content to make a selection of that layer shape. So I'm going to select the mountain, which is this layer here. I'll right-click on it, and I'll choose Select Layer Content. That puts a selection around only what's painted on that layer. Now if I choose an airbrush like Soft Airbrush, and I set the opacity a bit lower to 4, I can use a lighter sky color near the bottom of the mountain to separate it from the mountain in front of it. You can deselect the selection with Ctrl D. I'll repeat that airbrushing on the Mountain 2 layer, and right-click and choose Select Layer Content for the Mountain Layer 3 as well. I'm going to do that on the land far and the trees far, and that really helps to separate a lot of those planes from each other. Now I'm going to select the mountain layer. I'll use Select Layer Content to put a selection around that layer, and I'll use the wet oily brush with a slightly darker color to put in the shadow side of the mountain. We'll have our light coming from the right side of the painting, so our shadows will be on the left of each of the mountain peaks. I'm going to deselect my selection with Ctrl D, and then I'm going to use the eraser to shave off some of that mountain that I don't want anymore. Then I'll use a lighter color to put in some highlights, and I'll just use little dabs here with a small brush. That'll help it look like a rocky texture. We'll add some texture on the shadow side. We can use a color that's similar to the sky color, but blends nicely with that shadow color. Then I'll switch to the wet oily blender, and I'll just pull that down a little bit, blending it together. This also works as a dirty blender and adds a little bit of the paint color that you have selected. That really knocks that mountain peak back into the distance. We can go ahead and repeat that process on the Mountain 2 layer. You'll notice that sometimes I do test strokes and then I undo them. That's because I'm checking the color to see if I like it. If I don't like it, I'll try a different color that looks better. I'll add in a light almost white on the highlight side, and I'll use a bigger brush this time so that I get bigger chunky shapes. And then I'll go ahead and just blend that using the wet oily blender to soften it a bit. As I'm blending in the direction that the mountain is flowing or contouring. So I'll be pulling in the opposite direction on the highlight side than I would on the shadow side. I'll repeat that process on the Mountain 3 layer to add some detail to it. And then it's basically the same process for the trees. Those are going to have a highlight and a shadow side. So on the trees far 1 layer, I'll select that. I'll sample the base color that I'm using, and I'll just make that a bit lighter and maybe shift the hue a bit more toward yellow. Here and there I'll shift the hue around so that the trees aren't all the exact same shade of green. And then I'll blend with the wet oily blender. That'll help mix some of that paint together and soften the trees. And I'll repeat that process on the trees far 2 and on the trees far 3 layer. I want to start to add more detail as I move into the foreground, so in addition to 1 layer of shading, which we'll make darker, I'll also add a lighter color here. And again, I'm shifting the hue so that's not all the same green. Then I'll go through and blend it up with the wet oily blender. Next, I'll create a new layer above the trees far 3 layer. I'll call that land foreground, and I'll put in this yellowish green color using the wet oily blender. If I want to increase or decrease the opacity, I can do that to get different results of how much paint gets laid down while blending. But basically, I just wanted to get a little bit brighter as we go into the foreground there, so I went more toward a bright yellow color. Now we're ready to do work on the trees in the foreground. I'm going to go ahead and select the tree on the left, and I'll add in a shadow color. I'll do the same thing with the tree on the right. Now I'll select a lighter color, and I'll put in some lighter leaves on top of that mid-tone. And then I'll blend some of the edges together with the wet oily blender to add some intermediate colors. I can also blend some of the edges using a smaller blender just to add the sense of leaves. I know I want to add a trunk to at least one of these trees in the foreground, so I'll create a new layer on top of all the other layers called trunks. I'll use a really dark brown color along with the wet oily brush to put in just a basic tree trunk with not too many branches on it. Next, I'm going to select layer content for that layer, and I'll use lighter browns to build up the three-dimensional form. I want the highlight side to, of course, be on the right side. It can help add some three-dimensionality by reflecting some of the sky color on the far side of the tree as well. You may want to turn the opacity down for your brush to make it blend in more subtly. Now we need some leaves that'll cover the tree trunk, so I'm going to create a new layer called Leaves Foreground, and I'll put in some brighter leaves. I'll just use little dabs so it creates kind of leaf clump shapes. I'll make my color even brighter and shift the hue more toward yellow, and I'll get brighter and brighter leaves. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in the tree that's on the right, but that tree will eventually be in shadow on that side. I'll do a trick later to tint it or glaze it to make it darker. But for now, we want to make sure that the colors match, so we'll fill them in with leaves that are the same color. You'll also notice that I blended a bit with wet oily blender. Now keep in mind the tree left and right are on their own separate layers, so make sure to switch to the appropriate layer when you want to paint on that layer. I'm going to go ahead and go to the trunks layer, select layer content for it, and I'm going to darken it where it gets overlapped by the leaves. I'm using the wet oily blender. I'm going to select a lighter, brighter brown and just use a very fine brush to put in a little reflection on the tree on the highlight side. That really helps it stand out against the dark background. Next, I'll create a new layer that's above trees far 3. I'll call it trunks far. And I'm going to use a different brush here. Let's use Acrylics and Oils Opaque Detail Brush. I'll use a very fine brush with this just to sketch in some distant tree trunks and branches. This adds a lot of detail to the background. In a few of the lighter misty areas, I'll use one of those darker greens just to put in a few branches that are maybe in shadow. Above the land foreground layer, I'll add a new layer called Grass Foreground. And I'm going to use a light yellowish green color like this to add some little grass blades and little details to the background, just to help add some more character to that land. And then of course, if you want, you could blend it using the wet oily blender. I think that's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and save a copy of my artwork by going to File, Save As. Because now I'm going to flatten my layers, which means that all of these layers will become one single layer. I'll go to Layers, Drop All. This will allow me to blend all of my layers together now as if they're one single layer. I'm going to go to Blenders and choose Coarse Oily Blender. And I don't want to blend too hard with this brush, and I don't want too big of a brush. I just want to do short, quick little taps, and that will break up the edge of the paint a bit and help it look a little more bristly. But just be very careful where you do it. You don't want to destroy all your hard work here. You can also lightly blend on the mountain to pull out some more of those contours. I'm also going to blend a little bit on the grass in the foreground, and on the trees in the foreground as well. What this blending is doing is it's adding intermediate colors or blends of colors between, let's say, a lighter or a darker color. It also adds some texture and detail, and it really just helps your painting look a lot more painterly by having a balance of sharp and soft detail. I'm going to sample the sky color and poke a few holes in my leaves here, and you can see that after I blend them, they look more like brush strokes. They look more natural. Now I'm going to start to add some effects. I'll create a new layer called Overlay Cool. I'm going to go ahead and select a bluish color and fill it with the paint bucket, and I'll set the composite method to overlay, and that's going to change the overall flavor of the paint on our canvas. Next, I'm going to select a middle gray, and I'm going to use the soft airbrush just to airbrush along the bottom here, and that's essentially going to mask away some of that cool color. I want to remove it from the trees as well. If you click on the eyeball, you can do before and after and see exactly what that's done, and you can use the opacity slider to back that down a bit and make it a little more subtle. Something like that looks pretty good. I'm going to create a new layer above it, call it Overlay Warm, and I'll repeat that process with a warmer color. And again, select a medium gray color and use the airbrush to mask it away. Gray essentially is just making this overlay effect disappear wherever you paint gray. Do a before and after to see the effect that it's having, and then reduce the opacity until you get it looking the way you like. I'm going to go ahead and just turn both of those overlay layers off for a minute because I want to paint more on the background underneath them. And if you try to sample colors with the overlays selected, you're going to get the wrong color. You'll get the blend of the overlay and the other colors. So if you decide after the fact, after adding the overlays, that you want to paint on the background or the layers underneath the overlays, hide the overlays first. Then that way when you're sampling colors, they will be the correct colors. So I'm just adding a few more little leaf details here. I might go to another blender called Coarse Smear Blender Jitter and just tap on some of the leaves to blend them up. Just kind of experimenting here to find what works. I'm going to go back to the wet oily brush, and I think I like that dabbed look better, so I'm going to add a few little dabbed leaves along the edges there. I've also reduced the opacity of this brush, that way I can blend in some leaves that kind of fade out into the core of the tree. Now I put those leaves on a separate layer. I'll just drop that layer down. You can always add new layers when you're feeling like experimenting and you're not really sure if you're going to like the change. I'll create a new layer, and I'll use a dark green along with the wet oily brush just to paint over this tree that's on the right side. That'll darken it and turn that light side into a shadow side. I also want to darken a bit of the tree on the left as well. I'll reduce the opacity of that layer, which is set to multiply, and now we have a nice tinting for our tree. You can clean it up anywhere where you overpainted using the eraser. Next, I want to soften the sky a bit and get rid of some of those rough edges. I'll use the Blender Diffuser 1. Just blend over some of that stuff to soften it. I might very lightly blend over the mountain in the background too to soften that a bit. I also think I want to add a little bit more detail to those trees that are going up onto the mountain, so I'll just add a lighter color here with the wet oily brush, and just add in some little distant trees, and I'll blend them using the wet oily blender. I think that's all the painting I want to do on the background, so I'll turn my overlay layers back on and gauge my progress. I think this is starting to look pretty good, so I'll go ahead and save my progress by going to Save As. As I get near the end of the painting, sometimes I like to go to Canvas, rotate Canvas, and then flip Canvas horizontal. Sometimes the painting looks better flipped. In this case, I do like it flipped. I'm going to go to the layer 1 and I'm just going to drop that down to the canvas. I'll add a few more little fine details to the grass using yellow and the wet oily brush. I'll also sample some of those greens from the middle trees there, and I'll use it to break up some of those trunks. So some of the trunk is covered by leaves and isn't completely showing. And I think I'll add just a few more little final touches here, and we have a completed painting. I'll use Control S to save my progress, and then I'll choose Save As, and I'm going to save a copy as a PNG. That way I can post it on the web. Here's the completed painting. If you enjoyed this tutorial, check out some of my other tutorials for Corel Painter Essentials and the full version of Corel Painter. And if you'd like to be the first to know when I release new videos, click the subscribe button and enable notifications with the bell icon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.